China! It's all about the social cleavages in China. I picked these three pictures because this really does show you a couple of different cleavages that you will hear about regarding China. So the first one is a picture of just typical Han Chinese province where you have a more urban concentration of people. This picture is actually a group of people within China called the Uyghurs. And the Uyghurs are Turkish descent, and we'll get to them a little bit more. And they live in the more rural part of China. And this is the Dalai Lama. He is basically the Pope of Tibetan Buddhism. And he, of course, has caused, and Tibetan Buddhists have caused issues for the Han Chinese government ever since the time of Mao. And those would be symbolic of different cleavages that you will find. All right, one kind of cleavage, or the first kind of cleavage we're going to talk about, is ethnic. Okay, so this is the map of China. We know that the thing that makes China very unique is that it has a large concentration of one nation of people, the Han people. So the light blue are the Han Chinese. You do have a few Thai, and that's because it borders the Southeast Asian nations. You have a little bit of Korean because that's going to border the Korean Peninsula. You are going to have, well, the white is uninhabited areas. So in the more rural parts of China, you're going to have Mongolian people or Mongolian descent in the northern part. And then here you're Turk. Okay, and that's what the Uyghurs are Turkish descent. Okay, and then Tibetan. All right, so you have your Tibetan on the Tibetan plateau. Okay, but again, ethnic population is primarily Han Chinese. Most of your minority ethnic groups are going to be in the 5 autonomous regions. And those 5 autonomous regions are going to be right here in the west. Okay. There are 55 officially recognized minority groups, but they make a very small percentage of the population. The government policy towards these minority groups, since the government is run by Han Chinese, has been to try to get these rural areas to become more economically independent and more economically diverse and developed, and to suppress any dissident movement or any kind of protest movement coming from those areas. Especially with Tibet, any kind of push to become an independent country. So let's talk about Tibetans. Let's talk about the Dalai Lama. All right, the Dalai Lama is the head of Tibetan Buddhism. He is chosen through more like a mandate from heaven or divine right of kings. He is the authority in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. Now, the Tibetan Autonomous Region has been under Chinese military occupation since early 1950. Now, the former government of Tibet never recognized the authority of the Chinese government, never recognized the authority of the CCP. They are fiercely loyal to the Dalai Lama. Again, the Dalai Lama is a priest or a Buddhist monk who is basically believed to be the incarnation of a divine being. In 1959, the Dalai Lama fled to India. In 1959, then the Dalai Lama, then tried to come into China under Mao's regime and rebelled for the freedom of Tibet. It didn't work out, obviously. So, in retaliation, Mao suppressed Tibetan culture, which shouldn't be a surprise. He did that with ancient Chinese culture as well during the cultural revolutions. Now, you do have, since the moderates have taken control of the Chinese government and the CCP, you do have more freedom for the Tibetan region, and the Dalai Lama has a little bit more freedom than under Mao. But you still have Chinese troops that will go in and crush any independence movement or any dissent, um, any organized anti-government movement that you see in Tibet. The Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are unique. Um, they live in Xinjiang province. They're very close to the border with Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Uyghurs are Muslims of Turkish descent, um, and there are enclaves of the Uyghurs that are very militant and want to break off from China and become a separate Islamic state. They don't look like Han Chinese at all. There is not that cultural connection. There is no cross-cutting cleavages for the Uyghurs. They really just use violence, including bombings and assassinations, to try to separate from Chinese government. All right, so those are ethnic differences. Another huge thing that you have in China are cleavages based on urban and rural residents. Now, the one thing about urban and rural really has led to this idea of two Chinas. So 52.6% of the population of China has higher incomes, education, and social class, and you can guess it, they tend to live in the cities. Okay, and by 2011, this was the first time in Chinese history that people did not live in the rural areas, but rather more people lived in the urban areas. Now, there is increasing inequality. Nearly 500 million Chinese people live on less than $2 a day. So it's a huge population of Chinese who are living below the poverty line. 85% of China's poor live in rural areas and farm countryside. 66% are concentrated in the country's west, where the minority populations live, like Tibetans and the Uyghurs and the Mongolians. Almost half of China's population lives in rural areas, but in those rural areas, they actually possess only 12% of the country's wealth. So the wealth of the country is really concentrated in the populations that live in the urban areas. And again, sorry, because most of the poor people live in the West, there is a concentration of poverty among ethnic minorities versus the Han Chinese. So that is a huge coinciding cleavage that causes people like the Uyghurs to want to fight in independence movements.